Good morning and good afternoon to everyone that's joining us today. Welcome to our monthly webinar focusing e-mobility, electric mobility, sustainable transportation. I'm Juan Benitez. I'm part of the UNEP's office in Latin America. Today, we're going to be having two great guests talking about used electric vehicles, import and sales regulation in Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean. I'm going to be introducing them in a second, but just to remind everyone of sort of the structure of our webinar, we first have our guest presenting certain topics, and then we later allow to have some questions coming in. So if you're seeing us through YouTube, you can leave your questions and in the comment section, and then at the end, we're going to be looking at the questions individually and trying to answer them with the host, with the guests. So to give a brief introduction of our guest today, we have Veronica Ruiz Estana, who is our colleague of us at UNEP. She's the program manager of the Sustainable Mobility Unit, UNEP. And I'm going to give her in a minute the mic so she can give a larger introduction of the work that she's been doing at UNEP. And we also have Dr. Lewis Fulton. He's the director of the STEPS program, which stands for Sustainable Transportation and Energy Pathways of the Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Davis. So welcome to our guests. It's great to have you this morning or an afternoon, depending on our audience, but great to have you this morning. So that to move on with our webinar today, I'm going to give the mic to Veronica, who's going to give us an introduction of the work that UNEP is doing with sort of working together with the countries to advance in regulations and sort of exposing the need of reforms with used vehicles, and then also sort of mention a little bit of the work and the nexus and the relevance of this topic that we're talking today. So welcome, Veronica. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. And I'm speaking to you from Nairobi, Kenya, where the headquarters is of the UNEP program. I'm very happy to be here with my colleague, Lou Fulton. UNEP and University of California, Davis have been working together for many years together on transport projects and currently working together on vehicle energy efficiency projects, electric mobility projects, as well as used vehicles. So I'm very happy to be here together. I'll just share my screen and yeah, hope you can see this. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the used vehicles work of that we've been doing in UNEP, as well as the electric mobility work as well. So on the Global Electric Mobility Program of UNEP.
Sorry, Veronica, we're still not seeing your screen. I don't know if you can try sharing again.
Okay, let me try again. Okay, maybe now.
Yeah, now we're seeing yes. Yep.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Perfect.
All right. So, yeah, we're working on a global electric mobility program as well as a used vehicles program from the Sustainable Mobility Unit of UNEP, together with our regional offices globally. We have a global electric mobility program that supports countries around the world. At the moment, we're supporting more than 50 countries to promote and to regulate electric vehicles. We're working together with numerous partners across Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean, as well as Central and Eastern Europe. These projects are being carried out under 4 let's say, working groups or global thematic programs. We're focusing on light-duty vehicles, electric 2- and 3-wheelers, electric heavy-duty vehicles, as well as a program on charging infrastructure, batteries, and grid integration. We're working on this at a local level, at a city level, as well as at national level. And we're also able in this way to share a lot of experiences amongst the different countries in the different regions. The country projects focus on building capacity, creating awareness, establishing roadmaps for the countries and strategies, developing national policies, business models and finance schemes, as well as piloting electric vehicles on the ground. As you can see from the map, we do have programs and projects across all the various regions, and all in different stages of development. As we know, electric vehicles are a key feature of the transition to cleaner mobility across the world. And one thing that we've noticed as well is that many of the countries in the global south, developing countries, are importing numerous quantities, up to even 90% of their vehicle fleet is used vehicles. So we know that the transition to cleaner vehicles will include used vehicles, and it's therefore important for us to make the link between electric vehicles and used vehicles. Currently, most of these, the majority of these, are internal combustion engines, but we know that due to the policies and regulations that are taking place globally, these will soon become electric vehicles. So UNEP decided to do various studies on the flow and the scale and the regulations around used vehicles. And the first study was carried out in 2020. The second study in 2021 focused mainly on light-duty vehicles. Now we're also doing a study on heavy-duty vehicles, and that should be hopefully published by the end of this year. But some of the key findings that we found were that approximately 23 million used light-duty vehicles were exported between 2015 and 2020 to around 208 countries. About 66% of these were exported to developing and transitional countries. There were 4 major exporters that we looked at. These were the EU, the Japan, US, and South Korea. Out of these, the EU was the largest exporter, followed by Japan, the US, and then finally South Korea. In terms of electric vehicles, between 2017 and 2018, we had almost 800,000 vehicles exported from 3 main exporters, the EU, Japan, and South Korea. We know that regulations are a key feature of ensuring that the vehicles that are exported are clean and efficient and safe. And out of the 146 developing and transition countries that we studied, the majority of these, 45% of them, have weak or very weak policies. So this is something that UNEP decided was very important to address. And because of this, we established a used vehicles program. But maybe just to give you a bit more background first, just to look at the quantities and flows of these vehicles, we see that from Europe, we get a majority of vehicles going to West Africa from Europe, some as well to Latin America and the Caribbean. From Japan, because of course being right-hand drive, we get the majority going to East Africa and to countries that are right-hand drive, and then a few others going from South Korea and also from the US to certain regions. In terms of regulations for light-duty vehicles, UNEP established a ranking system from very good to very weak regulations, and these are comprised of mainly vehicle emission standards and age limits that we looked at across all the countries. As you can see, 62 countries that are shown here have good or very good measures, and the balance of them have weak or very weak regulations. Whereas some countries, and this is very much the case in countries that manufacture vehicles, there is a ban on the importation of used vehicles. And this is very much the case in Latin America and South America, as you can see, and in a few other countries in Africa, for example, and in Asia. In terms of heavy-duty vehicles, we see a similar kind of spread. There are the majority of countries with weak or very weak regulations. 29% of them have good or very good policies. And again, similarly, the countries that ban the importation of used vehicles ban them for both light and heavy-duty vehicles. Interestingly, Egypt does ban the importation of used vehicles. However, they do have a special allowance for used electric vehicles because they hope to incentivize the importation of electric vehicles. And that is one of the regulations or one of the strategies that they have taken up. So due to the importance of ensuring clean and safer used vehicles, UNEP has established a program and a project on this. The first focus has been on Africa, but we are rolling that out to Latin America, the Caribbean, and Asia as well. We are developing action plans with used vehicles requirements. We are helping countries to implement the action plans, helping to develop inspection and enforcement programs to ensure compliance of used vehicles regulations and agree on minimum requirements, and then also supporting on training, information, and communication. To date, in Africa, we have supported countries, for example, in West Africa, to adopt fuels and vehicles regulations. This ensures that they have a minimum level of vehicle emission standards and used vehicles restrictions that will encourage cleaner vehicles, including electric vehicles, to come in. And the same for East Africa, where they have just this year adopted a harmonized standard for the countries in the East Africa community. In Latin America and the Caribbean, interestingly, like we mentioned, countries either ban used vehicles, and most of them have a 5-year or below age limit, which means that most of the vehicles coming in, used vehicles coming into the region, are of a better quality. The exception there is Paraguay, which has an age limit of 10 years. And the other interesting thing with Paraguay is that they also import, they don't have a regulation on whether the vehicles that are imported need to be left-hand drive. They can also be right-hand drive. And we see a lot of vehicles from Japan, used vehicles from Japan coming into Paraguay, which is a concern in terms of safety, as well as the wheel has to be shifted from one side to the other. In terms of Central American countries, we do have countries that have some regulations in place, such as Costa Rica and Panama, in terms of fuels or vehicle emission standards in order to ensure cleaner vehicles and safer vehicles. However, we are supporting the countries to develop action plans and roadmaps to address this. In terms of used electric vehicles, we did have some data that indicated that between 2017 and 2020, there were numerous used electric vehicles being exported. In 2018 alone, there were over 200,000 used electric vehicles exported, and Japan is actually the major exporter of these globally at the moment. By region, Asia Pacific actually is the largest importer of used electric vehicles, with almost close to 400,000. between this period, between 2017 and 2020. But then followed by Eastern Central Europe. In Latin America, we had almost 30,000 in this period. And we see that that trend is growing. In terms of countries, we do have New Zealand that also imports numerous used electric vehicles. And interestingly, also Trinidad and Tobago from the Latin American Caribbean region. We do know that regulations do work in terms of incentivizing used electric vehicles and electric vehicles in general. So, for example, in the case of Mauritius, we see the upward trend once the regulations were put in place to incentivize electric and hybrid vehicles. So I think I will leave it at that and just thank everybody for working with us together. And I pass the word to Lou, my colleague. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronica. Thank you very much. So now we continue with Louis and his presentation. Welcome, Dr. Louis. So yeah, the floor is yours. And yeah, let us know if you have any issues with sharing your screen or anything. Your microphone's still not on, so.
Sorry. Yes, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for that. I enjoyed watching Veronica's presentation, and that will help me to skip a little bit of some of my stuff that was really related to the UN projects that are ongoing that we've relied on quite a bit. The UNEP work on secondhand vehicles is tremendously important. It's really almost the only thing we've got to go on the data that they generate and the analysis that they do. UC Davis has been working on this topic as well with UNEP and also to some degree with the World Bank. World Bank funded an analysis of secondhand vehicle flows and motorization management strategies in the developing world that we completed a phase of this past year, and there may be another phase involving modeling, but in any case, we are creating a model of secondhand vehicle flows. So I'll share some of that information in these remarks. I direct our Sustainable Transportation Energy Pathways program at the Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Davis. The work in this area I do in cooperation with Alyssa Kendall, who's a professor in civil engineering, and a postdoc, was a grad student, now a postdoc. Sarah Grajdura has been very involved as well as some other students. So it's an interesting area to work in, and I'll present just some background about electric vehicles and then get into some of the issues about secondhand vehicle flows and managing those kinds of systems and what it may mean as we get more and more electric vehicles. I'll mention first of all that in some of Veronica's figures that included hybrid electric vehicles that don't plug in, and of course there are many tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, I guess millions of hybrid electric vehicles, particularly in Japan and coming from Japan. And in my remarks, I'll exclude those. I'm only looking at plug-in vehicles. So these are battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids that have bigger batteries than non-plug-in hybrids and can run off of grid power for some amount of travel. So those are the two kinds of vehicles that we focus on when we think of electric vehicles, and that shows up in this slide. They are both increasing in number pretty rapidly now in terms of new vehicle sales and in terms of the numbers and types of models available in particularly US, Europe, and China. And I think Japan is playing a little bit catching up on the plug-in vehicles, but they're beginning to move fast. Korea is moving fast. India is moving fast, and so are other countries now. It's just all happening pretty quickly now. The vehicles are getting better. They have longer driving range than a few years ago, typically 300 kilometers or more for recent models. There are some, I mean, the higher end models such as the higher end Teslas might have 500. So the whole driving range issue is getting a lot better now. But sales prices, at least in the US and Europe, are still pretty high. They're typically over $35,000 a vehicle, and they can go up to over $100,000 a vehicle. But we are seeing much less expensive models appearing in India and China. And I think we are going to see these prices coming down as batteries get cheaper. They have been coming down. They'll continue to come down. And plug-in hybrid vehicles are particularly popular, I'd say, in Europe for larger, like SUV class vehicles. But in Europe now, we're seeing a strong emphasis on the decarbonization effect of these vehicles, and battery electrics, along with a clean grid, do better because they're never running on gasoline or diesel. And I think in Europe, we are seeing more pressure to shift to battery electrics and not as much plug-in hybrids. So we'll see how that goes. But I think in the second quarter of 2022, plug-in hybrid vehicle sales are actually down in Europe, whereas battery electrics are way up. Charging infrastructure is a huge issue in every country. For those who have home charging, then it's not such a big deal unless they're going to take longer trips. But for families with no opportunity for home charging because they live in apartments, multi-unit dwellings, or they just don't have a charger available at home. Not to mention if they want faster charging, at least in countries with 110 voltage systems, they have to install a charger system that can cost a couple of $1,000s. So there are some issues on charging, and most governments in the US and Europe are now scrambling to get as much public charging out there as they can that is affordable, that people can charge at night. So that's a big push now, I think, in many countries. And in the US, there have actually been, even though there's a political situation in the US making it hard to pass legislation, 2 bills have now been passed in the last year that strongly increase funding for both infrastructure, and in the most recent one, with more incentives and subsidies for the sales of electric vehicles to households that are not that are below an income threshold. So it's trying to avoid subsidies for very wealthy people and focus on those who most need vehicle subsidies to be able to get into buying electric vehicles. Here's the story in terms of sales during the pandemic. It didn't matter that overall vehicle sales were down in many countries. Electric vehicle sales were way up, and this is the global picture for new battery electrics and plug-in hybrids. And according to EV volumes, the global new light-duty vehicle market share of plug-in hybrids and electrics was over 8%, which is really something, I think, at this point, with close to 7 million vehicles sold, and it's up again in 2022. So it feels like it's really, really happening now. And I'm going to come back to what that means for secondhand vehicles for electrics in a minute. I'll just walk through a couple of slides about vehicle exports and imports in general, secondhand vehicles. And I think Veronica covered a lot of this quite well. We know that we see a lot of secondhand vehicles moving from the major economies producing those vehicles into secondhand markets, low middle income countries, typically, with 14 million that moved between the 4 years of 2015 to 2018. It's a big market, where 80% of those 14 million. But with those were just about all internal combustion engine vehicles. And along with that come the concerns that Veronica mentioned. You've got the pollutant control system requirements of those vehicles are often weak. They might be relatively inefficient vehicles with higher greenhouse gas emissions than new vehicles would have had. There are quality questions and the safety, and Veronica mentioned some of that. Energy consumption linked to the greenhouse gases. Costs to operate, of course, are a function both of the energy costs and maintenance costs. If these vehicles are not in good condition, those costs will be higher. And in general, they're seen to be hampering decarbonization goals compared to bringing in newer vehicles. And especially as we and in those countries that have clean electricity or are quickly adopting clean electricity, if we can speed the transition to electric vehicles, it's going to speed the whole process of decarbonizing our transport system. And of course, this is all true not only for four-wheel vehicles, but for two and three-wheel vehicles and for trucks. In this talk, I'm focusing on light-duty four-wheel vehicles, but most of this applies across the board for different kinds of vehicles. I'm gonna skip this one and just get into the questions of what happens when the vehicles enter these countries. You know, what is their end of life picture? And we are doing an end of life white paper right now. Alyssa is leading on that with UNEP to try to lay out what do we know and what don't we know about the end of life of internal combustion engine vehicles, but what it might mean for electric vehicles. And of course, they could be dismantled. They could end up sitting in sort of temporary locations for a while. When it comes to batteries, it could be that the batteries get repurposed. It could be that the batteries get recycled. They get left alone for a long time, or they somehow just get into the environment and create environmental damage because it's not being managed at all. So those are all possibilities, and we really want to avoid that last one. And it's not clear whether recycling or, let's say, repurposing is best. It might be situation dependent. Recycling is going to require a large enough volume of batteries to make that economically viable, and it may take some time before we have large enough numbers of the secondhand electric vehicles being retired that you can really justify creating a large-scale recycling operation. Europe and the US are, I think especially Europe, is looking very closely now creating those systems. US is a little behind, but it's coming. And I think same Japan and China are all going to have to create those kind of recycling systems because they're going to hit the numbers of vehicles very soon that are coming off duty, unless they send them to the developing or the importing country world. And that's a big question. So in our modeling, we're looking at scenarios where, let's say, most of the electric vehicles end up being eventually exported as secondhand vehicles or not, in which case, presumably, that's a scenario where internal combustion engine vehicles continue to be exported instead of electric vehicles. Two very different kinds of futures that we need to think about, which is better for the importing countries, which is better for the planet, and how do we manage the process of those decisions of what kind of vehicles end up getting exported and how many. Motorization management in the importing countries is critical. I'm not going to get into it in this talk. We don't have time, but we looked at 10 different aspects of motorization management, such as maintenance programs, in-use safety programs, emissions compliance, a lot of different things that major importing countries may or may not do well. And we put that in our report with kind of a ranking system. That hasn't been published yet, so I'm going to refrain on showing that. But most of the major importing markets are not scoring super high in all 10 categories. Many do well in 6 or 7, but there's work to be done in terms of managing the vehicles that are coming in and that are on the road in these countries. Monica showed these flows. I will mention that Africa takes vehicles from every part of the world, and that's kind of interesting. And that Latin America, for the most part, is not taking secondhand vehicles. They're banned in the major economies, the 3 biggest economies in South America, anyway. In Central America, that's not true. But as was mentioned, we still have some countries like Paraguay that are, and I think Chile are taking secondhand vehicles, and probably a few of the other ones. And I'll skip that one because she showed it. Although I will take a second to show that the definition of very good to very weak is based on emissions as well as the let's see, it's both the emissions and the age of the vehicle. So if the emissions are not up to this level, or if the age is not up to this level, then it would receive a lower rating. but you need to have a high Euro emissions requirement and a minimum of, let's say, 4 to 5 years. That's the maximum age the vehicle can come in order to receive a good rating. So that's how you kind of can think of those colors. Okay, so in trying to study this, the difficulty is there's very poor data on the flow of secondhand vehicles from country to country, and the data gathered by the UN is about the best we've got. There's one study from the Netherlands that has a lot of good detail on the vehicles that the secondhand vehicles they export. We haven't found a similar study from any of the other exporting countries. I think those kinds of studies are really important and needed for the US and other European and Asian exporters. We can find some data from the IEA. The Global Fuel Economy Initiative has been funding national efforts to track the registrations of vehicles and report on that. A lot of times always the registration data exists somehow, but getting it in the right format and sharing it publicly it can be challenging. And the real value, I think, with these GFEI databases is that we're getting information at the vehicle make and model level. So we might be able to now say that there are so many Toyota Corolla, even with variants, are being sold in this country or were sold in this particular year, and how many Hummers, if any. And to get to that level of detail is critical to be able to understand the trends and what's really happening. And if all we know is that there were 35,000 vehicles imported and we don't know anything about them, you can't really do a lot with that kind of information. So that's and I'll show some results of some initial work we've done where we could get the more detailed make model level information. And this is that. So I know I'm kind of running out of time here. I'm going to just kind of quickly go through a few of these findings. These were the countries we were able to get. I don't think any of them is really maybe Kenya is a major market, Ethiopia, Dominican Republic. They're fairly major markets. A few of these are not such big markets for secondhand imports. Colombia doesn't allow secondhand imports, but we did happen to get the data for Colombia, so we included it. And it's scratching the surface of what we'd like to be able to do, though at least we do have a couple of countries from Latin America, from Africa, and from Asia in this set. And this is roughly the kind of picture we're getting, that if you happen to take these three countries, and I don't want to pick on anybody here, but these are the countries we have, you can see the CO2 emissions level from these different countries. Colombia's in blue, so where only new vehicles are coming in, they've got lower CO2 than countries where a fair number of secondhand vehicles are coming in. Fuel economy is just the flipped version of CO2, so it's basically the same information, kilometers per liter, where Colombia is the highest. And I think we would generally find that the secondhand vehicles coming into these countries are not going to be as fuel efficient as newer vehicles. So also banning older secondhand vehicles will probably help you to improve your efficiency and lower your CO2 of your vehicles. This one shows that the average import age of a ban. So there's a restriction, for example, in the Dominican Republic of only 5 years, and in Kenya of 8 years. And it's simply that the ages of vehicles coming in don't totally correlate to these bans. In some cases, these are different years from that country, each dot. And there are some cases where a little bit older vehicles are coming in above what the ban would require. So that's something might be worth looking at some more. And then those without an age limit have roughly the highest ages of vehicles coming in, maybe averaging around 10 years. It's hard to make a lot of conclusions from slides like this, but this is the ages of vehicles from various countries. And in some cases, the ages are rising, and in other cases, the ages are falling. So that's interesting. and I'll just leave it at that. But it's good to understand these kinds of trends and why they might be happening. And in this one, it's the CO2 emissions from different countries over time. And we can see that in cases like Colombia, which is only allowing the new vehicles to come in, it's been dropping pretty steadily as the little blue wedge things. And in most cases, CO2 is dropping, but it's not dropping that fast in some cases. So that's the kind of data we're gathering. We're beginning to be able to make visualizations like this, but there's a lot of work to do. And the last thing I'll cover in about 3 minutes is our modeling project that we've begun to try to project out future electric vehicle sales and what it might mean for secondhand electric vehicle movements. And so this is preliminary, this is ongoing work, but the model is a sort of a stock and flow model where we actually, I'd say sales, stock, and flow. We project sales of all the different kinds of vehicles, and then a projection of what share might be electric going into the future, taking into account targets that have been set and different policies in different places, and then look at what it means for the stock of electric vehicles. Then, as those are retired from active service within that country, where do they go? Do they just get scrapped, or do they go to other countries? And so in this initial example, we have a picture just looking at Japan, US, and EU. China is very important too. It's not in here right now. There's Korea. There's many other, India, lots of places where new EVs are being sold, but we focused on these three here. And as you can see in the bullets, we're assuming the US reaches 100% EV sales by 2035, EU by 2035, and the US and Japan by 2040. It could turn out different, and it could be faster or slower. But right now, the EU is moving very quickly. They're over 20% market share across the EU for electric vehicles. So and they seem determined with their CO2 regs to get to 100%, certainly by 2035, if not sooner. And I think we're seeing signs of that in the US. And Japan is, like I said, kind of playing catch up. They're only around 3% electric vehicles apart from non-plug-in hybrids, but they're going to move fast as well. So you end up with around 35 million electric vehicles on the planet by 2040. That's a pretty large number. Of sales of electric vehicles by 2040. It probably means somewhere between 500 million and 1 billion electric vehicles, in these countries by that year, probably maybe around 500 million. And then as they get older and we have scrappage functions, some vehicles are scrapped after a year. That may be because they were lemons or because they were in a car accident. Some are scrapped after 5 years. Some are scrapped after 10 years. Japan sends a lot of vehicles out of their country after 3 to 5 years. So a lot of vehicles are leaving Japan. A lower percentage are leaving the EU and the US. But if we do a scenario where we assume that a certain percentage of the retired vehicles leave the country, using 80% in Japan, 60% in the US, and 40% in the EU, which really takes into account that a lot of the EU vehicles move to other parts of Europe. So I'm not including vehicles moving within Europe in this figure, just outside to, let's say, the global south. This is the picture we get at this point. I think you could do a lot to play with this kind of a figure. But by 2026, you're at about 500,000 a year. By 2030, you're over 1 million a year of electric plug-in vehicles hitting the global south. And by 2050, we're talking 12 million a year. So this curve starts to rise very rapidly, and it doesn't include new electric vehicles. It doesn't include other markets that may be sending secondhand vehicles out, such as China, Korea. So it probably underestimates what's hitting. But hopefully this is a good thing, but countries are going to need to get ready for this, and there isn't that much time. And so I'm going to leave it at that, and happy to take questions. But I think we all have to really get on this and figure out what policies are needed to manage this kind of a transition. Thank you.
Some main key points that you do want to we still have like a couple of minutes that we can give you additional.
Oh, okay. I was trying to finish so that there would be more time for Q&A, but I think I don't have that much else I want to say. I think that it's going to be very interesting to see what happens with country policies toward importing secondhand electric vehicles. And Veronica mentioned that Egypt is making a special case for secondhand electrics to import them. I didn't know that. That's very interesting. And I think that's something that other countries may want to consider, that even if you're putting a ban on internal combustion engine vehicles coming in, or older ones, you may want to consider electrics. But at the same time, you don't want old electric vehicles coming in that don't have much life left in them. You don't want to just be a scrappage yard for electric vehicles. And we're still learning how long really the active vehicle life is. It all comes down to that set of batteries on the vehicle. Batteries are evolving quickly. The cycle life of batteries keeps improving, but it seems like, a 5-year-old electric vehicle can still have a lot of life left in it. And
Perfect.
I have a 5-year-old electric vehicle that it's a plug-in hybrid. It's hardly lost any of its range yet. So these can be great vehicles, and very clean. And of course, they eliminate pollutant emissions from the vehicle, as well as the potential for CO2 life cycle if the electricity grid is clean. So, I mean, I think it really is important for policymakers around the world to figure out what is the right strategy for electric vehicles moving from one country to another. And of course, every country has to figure this out for themselves. But we don't want to see the dumping of old electric vehicles, but we also don't want to see the dumping of old ICE vehicles, and that
Yeah,
the producing countries are keeping all the electric vehicles for themselves. So it's a delicate balance there. And I think that's where a lot of the research has to go now.
perfect. No, thank you, Dr. Lewis. So I before I jump into the questions from the audience, I do have one question that it's both for you and for Veronica. So the questions I have is, just by seeing the flows, right? I can see the cars coming from specific areas, right, or regions, and the U as being one group one. But then I see them going everywhere, right? So then how do we work with the countries where we're bringing the cars from, right? So the exporters, right? And I understand the responsibility of the importers in setting the standards, and we're seeing that they don't have perhaps the emission standards or the age limit, right? But I also want to put the responsibility on the countries that are not putting in place, a final destination program for those vehicles, right? Especially as they are making commitments of saying, oh, we by 2035 we're going to have this, and by 2040 we're going to have this. But what is the responsibility or the role of the developed countries in sort of advancing with some sort of program that allows, okay, this is the kind of vehicles that we're going to allow to go outside of our borders. And yeah, so I think, Veronica, you can probably go first with the question, and then I do want to also have the input of Dr. Fulton.
Yeah, thank you very much. So UNEP is working closely with both importing countries and exporting countries to try to come to an agreement on the minimum requirements for the exportation of used vehicles. So in this case, we know that the major exporters are the EU, US, Japan, and South Korea. We know that China is likely to become increasingly important because just, I think it was 2019, they started allowing the exportation of used vehicles. We don't have enough data on China yet, but we know that they will become increasingly a more important exporter of used vehicles. So we're working together with all of these countries and regions for them to set in place regulations as well on what should be the minimum requirements for the used vehicles being exported by their countries. As Lou mentioned, we have been working very closely with the Netherlands government. They actually voluntarily did a study of their ports to see what were the quality of vehicles that were being exported. In this case, they were being exported to Africa. And this study was able to give a foundation of knowledge in terms of the quality of the used vehicles. So now we have some information on the quality, some information on the numbers and the flows. And we're using this for the collaboration and discussions with the exporting countries.
Yeah, I'll just add that I think that kind of dialogue's critical. I mean, I think the UN is the key here to get everyone around the table and talk about this, and figure out what is the right way to handle it globally. Because the problem is some strategies that are good for the country that wants to export vehicles may not be good for the countries that want to import vehicles, and vice versa. And there's got to be some kind of a at least a roughed out agreement on what makes sense for everybody in terms of what kinds of vehicles are moving around. And then I think part of that is what is the end of life management capability in the countries that are receiving vehicles, and what needs to happen at end of life. And a lot of this is still very open. These are sort of research questions that it's going to take a little longer to resolve. The possibility, for example, of repurposing lithium-ion batteries for, let's say, microgrids is very interesting. I think we still aren't quite sure how cost-effective that is compared to getting new purpose-built, microgrid batteries, or what scale do you need to make it cost-effective to start a recycling program, or a deconstruction and rebuild program for batteries that take advantage of the valuable materials that are in them. So some of it comes from countries doing this and getting some countries in front that help us learn what's the best way to operate, but some of it's going to take more research, I think, to see. But we certainly want to avoid a situation where either very old, well, it's kind of the situation now, right? Very old internal combustion engine vehicles are piling up in some countries that are not able to really manage that, or that we get that way with electric vehicles and their batteries. So getting that capability to handle end of life management in every country has really got to be the ultimate goal, I think.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Fulton, and thank you, Veronica. So one of the questions that it's coming up, it's about the risk that used electric vehicles can place. But I do want to expand that question a little bit and kind of bring again the relevance of why we're talking today. So beyond just the risk of electric vehicles, right? What are the risk and the consequences, and perhaps the threat that used import vehicles can have to like health, like not having an emission standards. So I will appreciate if both Veronica and Dr. Fulton can expand on those sort of the consequences, the externalities, and why this is relevant and why regulations are important.
Maybe you want waiting for Veronica to say something, but I'll go. I mean, obviously it's critical to understand what's happening as vehicles get older in terms of their performance on the roads. And I think we do have some pretty good data on that now. We know, for example, that there are super emitter, usually older internal combustion engine vehicles that are causing a significant share of the NOx, PM, and other kinds of air pollution that come from vehicles. And that, especially the newer vehicles tend to be relatively small contributors, and maybe certain types of vehicles are a big part of the problem. Trucks can be a very big part of the PM problem, for example. And now in California, a lot of the effort is on trucks, and not to mention that a lot of highways go alongside relatively disadvantaged communities, poorer communities. And so those kinds of issues are really getting a lot of attention now. So all of that matters. But, ongoing inspection programs that actually enforce getting vehicles off the road when they're high emitters, or really getting them fixed, dealing with issues like catalytic converters that are being removed from vehicles as they come into countries. Somehow we have to do better on that kind of a problem. But the thing about electric vehicles is most of those problems just go away all the vehicle related emissions problems, not necessarily safety, although probably safety too is going to get a lot better just because none of these vehicles are, they're all coming from an era when safety standards are very high in the producing countries. But at least in terms of emissions from the vehicle, you're just nailing that problem, right? So urban air pollutant emissions are going to get a lot better the more we bring electric vehicles in. Now, there's the whole electricity production component, and so that's all about how you make your electricity in your country. And we know that under UN targets and the commitments that countries are making, most countries are committed to strongly decarbonizing their electric grid over the next 20 to 30 years. So that plays extremely well also with increasing your electric vehicle stock over that time. So I'm confident that in most countries, electric vehicles are going to have a very low carbon emissions footprint. And then the final piece with electric vehicles is the carbon footprint to make that vehicle and then dispose of that vehicle. And that isn't that good right now. It's probably higher than the equivalent internal combustion engine vehicle, but I think it can be a lot better because we're going to have to decarbonize the whole supply chain anyway. And there's a lot of work going on in those areas. But that's the kind of work we're doing now. Alyssa's leading our efforts to try to understand how we can decarbonize and make more sustainable supply chains and disposal systems for electric vehicles that hopefully make them truly sustainable across the board.
Thank you, Dr. Fulton. Veronica, I don't know if you want to expand on that a little bit or we move.
Yeah, sure. I mean, maybe from the UNEP side, we're seeing that really the key to ensuring safer and cleaner used vehicles is definitely the regulations. And we're working with several partners on this, including the UN Road Safety Trust Fund, who is funding one of our projects. We're working with CETA and FIA, the FIA Foundation as well, firstly in Africa, to focus on this, and at the same time addressing, as I had mentioned before, the aspect of training and inspections programs and helping importing countries to ensure that the vehicles that are coming in and the vehicles that are in use will be as safe and as clean as possible for as long as possible. We also are going to start looking at supporting the countries in developing any scrappage programs that might be required, so that they'll be able to address the full life cycle of their vehicles as well coming in. In terms of electric vehicles, really used electric vehicles, our focus is mainly on light duty vehicles. We don't see that at the moment in 2- and 3-wheelers that we're going to be having any issues with used vehicles, because everything that is coming into Africa and Latin America of 2- and 3-wheelers are primarily new or locally assembled in terms of either importations or new. And then for heavy duty vehicles, this is something that we're just starting to analyze now and gather data on. So I think there's still a lot more that we can do in terms of data gathering, data collection, data analysis on the used vehicles and the electric vehicles. So this is something that, we'd like to encourage all partners to try and help us with, in particular the countries and the exporting countries that have very good data on what they themselves are shipping out. And to improve the data, not just in terms of numbers, but in terms of specific information that we need, and in order to understand better the quality of the vehicles that are actually being exported. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronica. So I'm gonna try to round 2 questions. So one of the questions was about the map that you show, Veronica, with sort of the weak policies and medium and sort of that graphic, and where can people find that? So I'm assuming that's on the report, but I don't know if you want to expand on that as well, please.
Yes, sure. I mean, we'll share some links with everybody here if possible in chat box for the different reports. So the map was developed based on the data that UNEP collected. And the data ranged primarily from 2015 to 2020 and analyzed all the data that we could gather between those years. And like I mentioned, it was data that was collected for up to 208 countries for some of the maps, and in some of the maps, so for 208 countries when we're looking at the flows and the scale, and about 146 countries when we're looking at the regulations. So all the datas and the maps are available in the report. So we'll share that with you. The first report was 2020, the second report was 2021, and hopefully we'll have an updated report for light-duty vehicles maybe by the end of this year, and also for heavy-duty vehicles as well, which the heavy-duty vehicles one has been even more challenging because, of course, there's even less data out there available on those vehicles.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Veronica, again. I'm going to move to a personal question in this case, and then I'm going to come back to the questions from the audience. But this question goes, we mentioned a lot about the countries, right? And the role of the countries implementing this sort of regulations, right? What happens with the role of subnational governments and cities and states, right? How can we sort of support those, and what are some of the perhaps incentives, disincentives, or perhaps other parallel regulations that they can set in place to sort of disincentivize, right, the imports, or give a final destination that's safe and that really sort of brings back, you know, the cycle of the vehicle to sort of a safe place, let's say.
Yeah, that's a great question. I have thoughts. I don't know, Veronica, if you want to go first. Or...
No, please go ahead.
Okay. Well, so I'm in California. It's a state. Sometimes it thinks it's a country, but it's a big one, right? We have 30 million people and 40 million people, excuse me. And we are able to have some power in policy setting and affecting markets, you know, that can trickle off into other parts of the United States. Not to mention that California works with other states on coordinating state level policy for example, electric vehicles. And so California has just about now formally adopted requirements that if manufacturers want to sell vehicles in California, there's already requirements going up to 2025 that by 2025, about 15% of the vehicles sold will have to be zero emission for light duty. Now it's going to be all the way to 2035. By 2035, 100% of sales have to be electric plug-in. And also for trucks, it's looking like it's going to be in the 2035 to 2040 range that we're going to see strong requirements to transition to high percentage electric vehicles. Depends a bit on the fleet type. But California can do this because it's a big market. And, because manufacturers either have to go along with it or leave California, and most of them are not going to leave such a big market. So that would work as well for other large markets, subnational markets in different countries, especially if several provinces or states can get together and agree, if they're allowed to agree on policies like that. The other thing at the urban or metro area level or regional level, I think it is very powerful when cities create low emission or zero emission zones. And if it gets to the point where, I can have my high polluting or any kind of polluting internal combustion engine vehicle, but I'm not allowed to drive it downtown, that's going to really affect a lot of people, I think, and their decision about what to buy. So I think that can be equally important, or it could be pricing, road pricing or cordon pricing systems. But any of those kinds of things, even though they're not covering, the whole country or even a whole state, but they're telling you, we're not going to tell you what you can own, but we're going to tell you where you can take that vehicle. I think these are going to be very important policies over the next 10 years.
Thanks, Lou, and I agree very much with what you've said. And I think something that I've seen that's interesting in Latin America and the Caribbean is that some countries tend to put in place regulations at city level first, before they move to national level. So, for example, in the case of Chile and Santiago, we've seen that they are converting the public transport system, the bus system, into electric, and then hopefully rolling this out to other cities. And this is the case also for when they put in place low sulfur fuels. It was first at city level and then afterwards at national level, as well as emission standards. So we see that there is an opportunity for cities to lead the way, major cities to lead the way, and then for this to roll out to other cities and then at national level. So this is definitely something that cities should encourage and should take on board, try and put in place policies for public transport, electric buses, for example. This is a good way to start, for example. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Fulton and Veronica. I'm going to give probably 4 more minutes to answer a couple of questions because we did get a lot of questions now at the end. And here, one from Jorge Herrera. He's asking if there is some sort of toolkit of sort of guide, like a guidelines of regulations for electric vehicles, batteries, final disposal, that can sort of help countries because there's sort of a lack of capacity at the time of setting up regulations, right? So I think that translating that question is like how we can support countries in sort of learning what are sort of the best practices or the best regulations to set in place, and what we can do to contribute to the capacity that's lacking, let's say.
That's a really good point. And it's good for us to understand exactly what are the needs of countries. And I noticed there's a question here from Grenada and from Belize, a few other countries in the Caribbean as well. So UNEP, as part of the Global Electric Mobility Program, we are working with several countries globally, like I mentioned, but also in the region. Grenada is one of them. And we have also a project in St. Lucia in Jamaica, Antigua and Barbuda, for example, on electric mobility. And these are some of the questions we're addressing or helping them to address. As part of the global program, we also have working groups. One of them is specifically on charging infrastructure, batteries, and so on. So all of this information will be made available not just to the participating countries, but regionally, to all the different countries across all the regions. And the way we're doing this is through a regional platform that will be able to host further webinars together with MOVE, as well as events and knowledge sharing. So that it's important for us to be able to disseminate this information as widely as possible. Our key stakeholders that we're working with are, of course, in the public sector through the different various ministries and city and local governments. However, it's also very important, and we're bringing in the private sector, civil society, and academia, so that we can try to share this knowledge and information as widely as possible. So we'll continue doing that. But thank you, very important points. And we'll make note of those for sharing with the various different working groups.
Thank you very much, Veronica and Dr. Fulton. So this is going to be the last question, and it comes from David Barrett. He says, are there any mandates for EV manufacturers to take back recycled disposed material batteries at this time? So I think translating again the question and trying to bringing a little bit more to the regional context, what are some of the regulations that we can set in place that do place some responsibility as well on the importers of the vehicles or the manufacturers of the vehicles, right? So that there is sort of a place responsibility of the commercial activity, let's say it, right?
So I'm not an expert on that. I mean, it's an interesting question in terms of what is the situation right now. But my understanding is that in maybe all the major economies. Well, I can't say for sure about China and Japan, but in the U.S. and Europe, I don't think manufacturers are responsible for anything about their vehicles after it goes out of warranty, right? So for 6 or 5 or 6 or 7 years, whatever it ends up being, they are responsible. Although even then, if the vehicle is retired, like if it has a crash or something, it's not like they have to take the vehicle back. It just goes into the scrappage system that the country has. There are requirements that they have to produce the vehicle to make it easier to dispose of it or to recover more useful materials and things like that. There are increasing numbers of requirements when you build the car. But I mean, this is where we're going now, is looking at who's responsible at end of life, what systems do we need to ensure that these vehicles are recovered, reused, or the parts of the vehicles and disposed of safely and environmentally soundly. So I mean, I think it's kind of all an open question, but ultimately it's going to be governments that have to take the responsibility to make sure that the systems are working well.
Perfect. I think that was a good way to end, Dr. Fulton. And I think it's important to sort of set in place the role, whose role it is, right, to set up the sort of norms and standards and everything that it's gonna sort of lead the effect that this can have and mitigate all the potential externalities, right? So I think we're sort of above the time that we have for the webinars. But before saying goodbye, I do want to say thanks to both of you for the time and the interest in sharing with our audience all this sort of knowledge and studies and work that both the UN and also the academia, particularly the University of California, Davis, is doing. And to the audience, we're sort of sharing some of the reports from UNEP on our chat, so you can go ahead and check the information that Veronica was sharing. And we'll also have this webinar available on our YouTube channel permanently. So if you want to go back to it, you'll be able to do it. So thank you again to all the audience and all the countries and allies and partners that have joined us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.